This episode is brought to you by Dashlane. Try Dashlane Premium free for 30 days at dashlane.com/infographics. And never forget another password and keep all your online accounts secure. In the late 70s and 80s, the US had a rising drug problem. Use of drugs was up across the board, with every age group and ethnicity experiencing a rise in drug-related offenses. Drug smuggling began to increase exponentially thanks to a very lucrative drug market in the US, and this saw the rise of powerful cartels, all vying with each other for a piece of the American pie. With the cartels came the rise of violent crime, and US lawmakers believed that something had to be done. Thus, the infamous war on drugs began, and along with it, mandatory minimums, automatic jail time for even minor drug offenses. These mandatory minimums gave out harsh sentences for possession of drugs over certain limits. For instance, 28 grams of crack cocaine was enough to earn you 5 years prison time, while 280 grams would net you 10 years, no appeal, and automatic. 100 grams of heroin nets you 5 years, and 1,000 grams is a 10-year sentence. Just a single gram of PCP will get you 5, while 10 grams is enough to put you in jail for 10 years. The punishments were harsh, but legislators hoped that such a stiff sentence and zero-tolerance attitude would serve to dissuade individuals from pursuing a life of drugs and crime. Sadly, drug addiction doesn't work like that, and in many impoverished neighborhoods with few, if any, other options, mandatory minimums did nothing to scare away would-be drug pushers and users alike. These mandatory minimums proved disastrous for first-time drug offenders, as they pretty much ensured that instead of receiving the counseling and re-education they needed, they would instead be stuck in jail with hardened criminals for half a decade or more. Prisons quickly became a crime school due to the flood of first-time offenders on mandatory minimum sentences getting taught how to better smuggle, sell, or produce drugs by more hardened inmates, serving longer sentences. In effect, American jails became a recruitment college for drug dealers and manufacturers, graduating in 5 years with a master's degree in breaking the law. Measures that had been meant to deter crime had instead ensured that criminals who were punished under these new mandatory minimum laws would leave prison behind as better, wiser criminals. Mandatory minimums, however, have also unfairly targeted minorities. For example, while 28 grams of crack cocaine is enough to get you 5 years of prison time, it takes a whopping 500 grams of powdered cocaine to get the same sentence. The overt racism isn't obvious at first, until you consider that crack cocaine is typically pushed in lower-income neighborhoods, which are disproportionately inhabited by minorities, while more affluent white people were sold powdered cocaine. To be fair, crack cocaine is generally believed to be more addictive than powdered cocaine, and the legislators who drew up mandatory minimum sentences were facing an environment where there was, and still is, much more crack cocaine on the street than powdered cocaine. So in a way, it makes sense to target crack cocaine more vigorously than powdered cocaine, as there will be more users. And the hope is that if enough users and sellers were caught with the low amount needed for a mandatory minimum sentence, then it would act to dissuade others from using the drug. This belief was meant to keep the crack epidemic from growing through fear of punishment, but as we said earlier, drug addiction sadly doesn't work like that. Yet the fact that one drug was overwhelmingly used by minorities over the other has resulted in a huge disparity in the American prison population. Incarceration rates show that there are 2,724 black prisoners per 100,000 people versus 465 white prisoners, with Latinos sitting somewhere in the middle at 1,091. And even when arrested for the same crime, black prisoners receive on average 13.1% longer sentences than white prisoners. Longer sentences can't be blamed on the same misplaced intentions behind mandatory minimums, and sadly, blacks receiving longer sentences on average than whites come down to an inherent racial bias within the justice system. Mandatory minimums saw a flood of minority offenders hit the court system, and many judges developed a bias toward communities they saw as inherently more criminal. This attitude, however, completely ignored the many factors behind increased criminality amongst minority communities, chief of which was a lack of economic and educational opportunities, which led many to resort to crime. Today, people are questioning the effectiveness of mandatory minimums and calling for an end to the practice. With the largest prison population in the world at around 1.5 million prisoners, the US leads the way in incarceration. Another 5 million Americans are also either on parole or on probation and under state supervision. While the US is a relatively large nation, and thus it's expected that it would have more prisoners than a smaller nation, the US leads the way even in rate of incarceration. So what would happen if suddenly amnesty was granted to every American prisoner? How would would that affect society if every single prisoner was released at the same time? Well, first, let's look at what people are in prison for. First is violent crimes. In state prisons, there are 182,000 prisoners in jail for murder, and in federal prison, we have just 2,700 for the same crime. That's almost 185,000 murderers suddenly let loose all across America. Certainly not a pretty picture. Next, we have 175,000 prisoners total behind bars for robbery, and 165,000 for rape or sexual assault. Public order crimes, things such as prostitution, driving under the influence, pedophilia, and other crimes that go against the social norm, number at about 178,000. But those offenders vary in severity and danger. Arguably, someone arrested for prostitution poses a much less serious threat to the safety of the community than a drunk driver. Drug offenses such as trafficking and manufacturing come next, with around 228,000 people behind bars for peddling drugs. That would be a great deal of drug dealers and manufacturers suddenly let loose, although this figure also includes people whose crimes were conducted in relation to drugs. Aggravated or simple assault comes next, with about 135,000 prisoners. These are the lads who like a good fight and get locked up for it, although typically these assaults end in serious injury or a threat to life. Burglary is next with 121,000 prisoners, but this is different from larceny with 44,000 prisoners, in that it's a low-level crime. Burglary is basically the stick-up kids that prowl bad neighborhoods or break into your house, while larceny is more professional and involves greater sums of money. So what happens if all these prisoners go loose suddenly? Well, if you live in the American South or in California, then we have bad news for you because the majority of prisoners are held in Texas, California, Florida, and Georgia, respectively. In Texas, you would have 215,000 prisoners going free all at once, while in California you'd see 201,000 inmates go free. Florida would have 153,000 former cons on its streets, and Georgia would see 88,500 prisoners set loose. The safest place would actually be Vermont in the District of Columbia, with each just holding 1,800 prisoners. Basically, you want to stay out of sunny California if the prisons are empty, as well as staying out of the southern United States. But of course, not every prisoner is a con waiting to strike again, and so the real question is, if released, how much of the prison population would simply re-offend? Well, the US has never been good at reducing recidivism rates, or the rate at which released prisoners will re-offend and wind up back in prison, so the news isn't good. Today, 68% of prisoners released from prison were re-arrested within 3 years of their release, and a whopping 77% of prisoners were re-arrested within 5 years. Those are pretty appalling statistics, so it's clear that if all prisoners were released at once, the US would see a major crime wave. If, however, the US took steps to try and reduce recidivism, then we would see a far less impact on our crime stats with the release of all the prisoners. People re-offend because after leaving prison, they simply have no other option but to engage in crime in order to make ends meet. Others enter jail as first-time offenders and spend 5 years or more in crime college being turned into hardened, smarter criminals, with almost no chance for prisoners to improve themselves or turn their lives around while in prison, such as education and job skills training programs. It's no surprise that newly released prisoners see no other option but to return to crime. A prisoner with options is far less to re-offend. And prisoners who graduate from college have a stunning 20% recidivism rate. The proof is in the pudding, as they say, and if we simply gave our prisoners opportunities to educate themselves, we would have less crime and spend less money punishing crime. Sadly, American culture toward crime is to simply blindly punish offenders, despite this tactic very clearly not working. But what would the impact be on daily life? Well, most people would likely hardly notice, to be honest. The idea of hundreds of thousands of prisoners being released all at once sounds terrifying, and we would expect our cities to turn into lawless war zones. Yet the reality is that most crimes occur in lower-income neighborhoods, and so the majority of people would be shielded from the repercussions of a mass release of prisoners simply due to their economic privilege. Minority populations would suffer the most as they occupy the majority of lower-income neighborhoods, and would be preyed upon primarily by newly released cons. We could expect a massive police backlash against rising crime as local police forces struggle to stay on top of a sudden crime wave. It wouldn't take very long for jails to start filling up again as the police immediately begin rearresting offenders. More terrifyingly, though, is the likelihood of full-out gang wars rocking the nation's biggest cities, as entire gangs are released simultaneously and compete for new and old territory. The influx of seasoned and veteran gangbangers to existing gangs on the outside would also make these gangs much smarter and better at committing crimes. Entire criminal networks would arise virtually overnight, thanks to all of the connections cons make while in prison. Police would have to launch a focused and systematic effort to break the new criminal networks that would arise and would indubitably need federal assistance to do so. It could very well take the police years, perhaps decades, to fully break the crime networks that would arise from hundreds of thousands of cons suddenly being let loose. The one thing that American prisons are really good at is building a better con. A prisoner may go to jail being a local neighborhood hustler and leave with the connections to international crime cartels. Yet, as we mentioned, you would likely be insulated from most of these effects. As usual, the high crime rates would affect the poorest neighborhoods, as crime has historically done. Some of your favorite spots to hang out may become unsafe to do so after dark, but your normal day-to-day life will largely be unaffected unless you happen to live in one of those poorer neighborhoods. Minority populations would bear the brunt of the crime wave that would arise, and the rest of society would likely not notice many ill effects to their daily lives. Despite all this, though, it's important to remember that in the US, crime has been going down for decades, and today we live in a safer US than ever before. Perhaps it's time for Americans to rethink their attitude on punishment and follow the lead of nations like Sweden, who focus on educating and fixing their criminals rather than just punishing them. But while traditional crime is on the decline, one type that continues to grow and become a bigger and bigger threat is cybercrime. Hackers, malware, data thieves, they're all looking to take advantage of you, but knowing how to protect yourself online is hard. Which is why we here at the Infographics Show use Dashlane, the one and only tool you need to stay safe online. Dashlane auto-generates and stores super strong unique passwords for your different online accounts, so signing in is as easy as just clicking a single button. While their multi-country VPN lets you browse safely and privately no matter where you are, across any device, and sends you breach alerts for when one of your online accounts is compromised by a hack. Try Dashlane and their feature-packed VPN today. Head on over to dashlane.com/infographics for a free 30-day trial. And if you use the coupon code Infographics, you can get 10% off a premium subscription today. What's your plan if all the criminals in your local jails and prisons were released? Become a real-life Batman in Arkham Asylum? Tell us in the comments. Now go watch our other video. The man's so violent even other prisoners fear him. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.